The most important question in the room was followed by complete silence. Commander Ethan Brooks had attended hundreds of briefings during his career, but very few felt like this one. The conference room was filled with experienced operators, analysts, aviation specialists, and mission planners. Large digital maps covered the walls. Weather data scrolled across multiple screens. Reports were stacked across a long table that had been occupied for nearly 6 hours. Coffee cups sat forgotten beside notebooks. Conversations had grown shorter with each passing hour. Every person present understood the challenge in front of them. The problem was not a lack of resources. It was not a lack of talent. The room contained some of the most capable professionals Ethan had ever worked with. Yet every proposed solution created new complications. Every answer seemed to generate 2 more questions. Outside the building, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the airfield. Aircraft rested quietly in the distance. Service vehicles moved slowly between hangars. The base appeared calm from the outside. Inside the briefing room, however, frustration was becoming impossible to hide. One analyst argued for a more aggressive approach. Another recommended delaying action until additional information became available. A third suggested a completely different strategy. None of them sounded convincing anymore. Ethan listened carefully to every opinion. He respected the people around him. They had earned their seats at that table through years of dedication and performance. But respect did not create solutions. After another 20 minutes of discussion, the room finally fell quiet. No one had anything new to add. Ethan stood from his chair and walked toward the large display screen at the front of the room. He studied the information for several seconds before turning back toward the group. The expression on his face carried the weight of responsibility. Everyone noticed it. Everyone stopped talking. Then he asked a simple question. Who can make this work? The words were not dramatic. They were not loud. Yet they changed the atmosphere instantly. Silence filled the room. Ethan waited. Nobody answered. A few people looked down at their notes. Others stared at the maps. One specialist slowly folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. Another glanced toward a colleague as if expecting someone else to speak first. Nobody did. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The silence became its own answer. Ethan felt disappointment settle across the room. Not because these people lacked ability. Because for the first time all day, they had stopped pretending certainty existed. Sometimes honesty arrives disguised as silence. Ethan understood that better than most. His eyes moved across the room one final time. Experienced faces looked back at him. Intelligent people. Accomplished people. Yet none of them seemed willing to claim they had the answer. Near the back of the room, partially hidden behind a row of senior personnel, sat a woman most people had barely noticed since the meeting began. She had arrived quietly. She had spoken very little. A notebook rested on the table in front of her. While others debated and argued throughout the afternoon, she spent most of her time listening, observing, thinking. Few people knew her name. Even fewer understood why she had been invited. At that moment, nobody in the room realized that the quiet woman seated near the wall would soon change the entire direction of the conversation. And before the evening was over, several people would remember this meeting for the rest of their lives. The silence remained in the room long after Commander Ethan Brooks asked his question. Nobody rushed to fill it. Nobody offered a confident answer simply to break the tension. In many ways, that made the moment more unsettling. The room was filled with experts. Yet expertise seemed unusually quiet that afternoon. Ethan slowly returned to his chair and studied the people gathered around the table. Analysts reviewed notes they had already reviewed. Operators stared at maps they knew almost by memory. Aviation specialists exchanged uncertain looks. For the first time all day, everyone appeared aware of the same uncomfortable truth. The problem was larger than any individual perspective. Near the back wall, the woman with the notebook remained silent. She had not participated in the debates. She had not challenged anyone's conclusions. She simply listened. Her name was Rebecca Hayes. Most people in the room knew that much and very little else. Her flight suit displayed no unusual markings. Her posture was relaxed. She looked more like someone attending a briefing out of obligation than someone carrying an answer. That was why almost nobody paid attention to her. Almost nobody. Across the table, a senior aviation officer named Mark Sullivan glanced toward the back of the room. His expression changed slightly when his eyes landed on Rebecca. The reaction lasted less than a second, but Ethan noticed it. Years of leadership had trained him to notice small things. Mark quickly looked away and returned his attention to the discussion. Yet the brief reaction remained in Ethan's mind. It was not surprise. It was recognition. The distinction mattered. Another 20 minutes passed. The meeting continued without progress. New possibilities were suggested. Old ideas were reconsidered. Nothing moved the room forward. Eventually, Ethan stood again and walked toward the large map display. Colored markers covered the screen. Routes, environmental data, timing windows, layers of information stacked upon one another. The problem looked complicated because it was complicated. Yet Ethan could not shake the feeling that everyone was staring at the same information from the same angle. He turned back toward the room. That was when he noticed something unusual. Rebecca was not looking at the map. She was looking out the window, not absent-mindedly, not distracted, thoughtfully, as though something beyond the briefing room interested her more than the discussion itself. Ethan followed her gaze. Outside, aircraft sat quietly beneath the fading afternoon sun. Ground crews moved between hangars. Nothing appeared remarkable, yet Rebecca continued watching. Ethan filed the observation away without comment. Meanwhile, several older officers had started paying closer attention to her as well. None of them said anything. They simply watched. One retired advisor, sitting near the far corner of the room, lowered his reading glasses and studied Rebecca for several seconds before leaning back in his chair. A faint smile crossed his face. Again, Ethan noticed. Again, nobody explained. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The woman nobody seemed interested in was somehow attracting the attention of the most experienced people present. Finally, during a pause in the discussion, one of the younger analysts glanced toward Rebecca and asked a simple question. Has she said anything all day? A few people smiled quietly. Mark Sullivan looked down at his notes. The retired advisor chuckled under his breath. Ethan immediately recognized that something had changed. The room was no longer focused entirely on the problem. Curiosity had found a new target. Rebecca remained seated, completely unaware, or perhaps completely unconcerned. She continued writing occasional notes in her notebook. Calm, patient, silent. And as the afternoon shadows stretched across the airfield outside, more and more people in the room began wondering the same thing. If she was so unimportant, why were the most experienced people there unable to stop watching her? The question from the young analyst lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. Has she said anything all day? It was a simple observation, yet it shifted the attention of nearly everyone present. For the first time since the briefing began, people were looking away from the maps and reports and toward Rebecca Hayes. She did not seem to notice. Or perhaps she noticed and chose not to react. Either possibility felt equally believable. Rebecca continued writing occasional notes while the discussion moved around her. Commander Ethan Brooks studied the room carefully. The reactions fascinated him. Several younger personnel appeared confused by the sudden interest surrounding someone they had barely acknowledged all afternoon. The older members of the room, however, displayed something different. Recognition, respect, curiosity. The more Ethan watched them, the more convinced he became that there was a story nobody had told him yet. Eventually, another pause settled over the meeting. The latest proposal had failed to generate enthusiasm. The room had run low on fresh ideas. Outside, the sunlight had begun fading into the warm colors of evening. Long shadows stretched across the runway beyond the conference room windows. Ethan was about to redirect the discussion when a chair quietly moved. The sound was small, yet every head turned. Rebecca Hayes had stood up. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No sudden speech. No confident declaration. She simply closed her notebook and rose from her chair. The room became completely silent. Ethan noticed something extraordinary. Several senior personnel immediately straightened in their seats. Mark Sullivan stopped writing. The retired advisor lowered his hands from the table. One of the oldest officers present slowly removed his glasses. Nobody seemed surprised that Rebecca stood. Instead, they looked like people waiting for something they had seen before. The younger members of the room noticed it too. Confusion spread across their faces. Why was everyone reacting this way? Rebecca remained calm. Her expression showed neither confidence nor uncertainty. It showed thoughtfulness. She looked toward the large map at the front of the room and then toward Ethan. May I ask a question? Her voice was steady and quiet. Ethan nodded immediately. Of course. Rebecca stepped closer to the display screen. How long have we been discussing solutions? Several people exchanged glances. Ethan checked his watch. Almost 6 hours. Rebecca nodded. And how many of those 6 hours have been spent questioning the assumptions behind the problem? Nobody answered. The silence returned. Different this time. Less defensive. More reflective. Rebecca continued. Everyone here has been trying to improve the answer. Her eyes moved across the room. What if the question is wrong? A few younger analysts frowned. One opened a notebook. Another looked toward the map with renewed attention. Across the table, Mark Sullivan smiled faintly. The retired advisor leaned back and folded his arms. Ethan felt something shift inside the room. Not agreement. Possibility. Rebecca was not offering a solution. She was changing the direction of the conversation. Explain, Ethan said. Rebecca walked toward the display and studied it for several seconds. The challenge assumes a particular approach. She pointed towards several markers on the map. Every discussion today has accepted that assumption. Her finger moved to another section of the display. What if that assumption is the source of the problem? The room grew even quieter. No one interrupted. No one dismissed her observation. Ethan realized something remarkable was happening. The woman who had spoken less than 20 sentences all afternoon now held the complete attention of every person in the room. Not because she demanded it, because she had earned it in less than a minute. And as the fading sunlight illuminated the map behind her, Ethan began to understand why certain people had reacted so strongly when they first noticed her name. Commander Ethan Brooks remained standing as Rebecca Hayes studied the map. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody challenged her. The atmosphere inside the conference room had changed completely. Just minutes earlier, people had been defending their ideas. Now they were listening. Rebecca's question continued, echoing through the room. What if the assumption is the source of the problem? Ethan looked around the table and noticed something unusual. The most experienced people present were no longer examining the map. They were watching Rebecca. That observation told him more than any personnel file ever could. Rebecca remained focused on the display. She traced several routes across the screen with her finger before stepping back. Every proposal today starts from the same premise, she said calmly. Everyone assumes the answer must come from this direction. She pointed toward one section of the operational plan. That is why every discussion sounds different but feels the same. Several analysts exchanged glances. One of them quickly opened a notebook and began writing. Another zoomed out the map display to view the larger area. Ethan noticed people re-evaluating information they had been staring at for hours. Rebecca had not provided an answer yet. She had simply given them a new way to look at the problem. Mark Sullivan leaned forward. When did you start thinking that? Rebecca smiled slightly. About 20 minutes after the meeting began. A few people laughed quietly. Not because the answer was funny. Because it was honest. Ethan folded his arms. Then why wait 6 hours to say something? Rebecca looked toward him. Because 6 hours ago nobody was ready to hear it. The room fell silent again. Ethan knew immediately she was right. Earlier in the afternoon, everyone had been too invested in defending their own solutions. Now they were searching for one. There was a difference. The retired advisor sitting near the corner nodded slowly. Still the same, he murmured. Several older officers smiled. The younger personnel looked increasingly confused. They felt as though they had walked into the middle of a story without hearing the beginning. Ethan decided it was time to learn more. How long have you been doing this? Rebecca tilted her head slightly. Doing what? Seeing things other people miss. A faint smile crossed her face. Probably the same amount of time everyone else has. Ethan waited. Rebecca continued. I just learned to pay attention to different details. The answer sounded simple. Yet nobody dismissed it. She returned her attention to the display and began asking questions. Not dramatic questions. Specific ones. Why had a particular route been selected? Why were certain environmental factors weighted more heavily than others? Why had previous assumptions never been challenged? One by one, she exposed small gaps in the planning process. None of them were catastrophic. None of them were obvious. But together they formed a pattern. As the discussion continued, Ethan noticed something remarkable. The room was no longer struggling to find answers. The room was learning how to ask better questions. Outside, the sun dipped lower over the airfield. Golden light filtered through the conference room windows. The maps, reports, and displays looked exactly the same as they had 6 hours earlier. Yet everything felt different. Rebecca eventually stepped away from the screen and closed her notebook. I need to review a few things before I suggest a direction. Nobody objected. Nobody demanded immediate answers. They trusted her process now. Ethan watched her return to her seat and realized the meeting had reached a turning point. The woman nobody noticed at the beginning of the day had become the person everyone was listening to. And the most surprising part was that she never once tried to take control of the room. She simply changed the way the room thought. Rebecca Hayes did not rush toward a conclusion. That was the first thing Commander Ethan Brooks noticed after the meeting shifted in her direction. Most people, once given the attention of an entire room, felt pressure to provide immediate answers. Rebecca seemed completely comfortable doing the opposite. She spent the next hour reviewing information everyone else had already examined. The difference was not what she looked at. It was how she looked at it. The conference room had grown quieter. The debates were gone. Conversations had become focused and deliberate. Analysts pulled up additional data sets. Specialists reopened reports they had considered finished. Nobody complained. For the first time all day, the room felt productive. Ethan remained near the display screens, watching Rebecca work. She rarely spoke. Occasionally, she asked a short question. Sometimes she requested a specific report. Other times, she simply stared at the map for several minutes without saying anything. Yet every question she asked revealed another detail that had escaped attention earlier. The pattern fascinated Ethan. Rebecca never searched for dramatic discoveries. She searched for small inconsistencies, tiny pieces of information that did not quite fit with the larger picture. One analyst eventually approached her with several environmental reports. "We already reviewed these," he said. Rebecca nodded. "I know. Then what are you looking for?" She smiled faintly. The reason everyone reached the same conclusion. The analyst frowned. "Is that a bad thing?" Rebecca looked toward the display. "Sometimes it is." Ethan heard the exchange and found himself thinking about it long afterward. Around the room, people had spent the entire afternoon trying to find the right answer. Rebecca seemed more interested in understanding why intelligent people had arrived at the wrong one. As evening settled across the base, the sunlight faded beyond the windows. The conference room lights reflected softly across maps and notebooks. Coffee was replaced. New reports arrived. Yet Rebecca's focus never changed. At one point she stood and walked toward the large map again. This time she did not study the primary area everyone had been discussing. Instead she examined surrounding terrain, weather patterns, support routes, and timing estimates. Details most people treated as secondary. Mark Sullivan noticed it too. "You are looking outside the problem area." Rebecca nodded. "Because the answer may be outside the problem area." Several younger personnel immediately began reviewing adjacent sectors. Within minutes, they started noticing relationships they had overlooked earlier. Ethan watched the process unfold. Nobody was being corrected. Nobody was being embarrassed. Rebecca never pointed out mistakes. She simply widened the frame until people could see more than they had seen before. That approach earned respect faster than any display of expertise could have. Hours earlier, she had been almost invisible. Now people waited patiently whenever she paused to think. Finally, Rebecca closed a report and looked toward Ethan. "I think I understand what is happening." The room became still. Ethan did not ask for an immediate explanation. Neither did anyone else. They had learned something important about her over the past few hours. Rebecca spoke only when she had something worth saying. She gathered her notes and walked toward the display one more time. Her expression remained calm. No excitement. No pride. Just quiet certainty. Ethan felt a strange sense of anticipation settle over the room. The answer was close. Everyone could feel it. Yet what impressed him most was not the possibility of success. It was the realization that the person leading them toward it had spent most of the day saying almost nothing at all. And somehow, that made every word she spoke matter more. Rebecca Hayes placed her notebook on the table and looked across the room. Every conversation stopped. The conference room that had been filled with debate only hours earlier now felt completely different. People were listening, not because she held authority over them, not because she demanded attention, because she had earned their trust one observation at a time. Commander Ethan Brooks remained near the display screen. He noticed how still the room had become. Analysts sat forward in their chairs. Specialists lowered their reports. Even the most experienced officers appeared curious. Rebecca studied the large map one final time before speaking. "The problem is not where everyone thinks it is." Nobody interrupted. She pointed toward the section that had dominated discussion throughout the day. This area keeps receiving all of our attention. Her finger moved toward a different part of the display. But the conditions affecting it begin over here. Several analysts immediately turned toward their laptops. Rebecca continued. Everyone focused on the result. Very few people examined the chain of events creating the result. Ethan felt a wave of realization pass through the room. It was visible on people's faces. Some looked surprised. Others looked frustrated with themselves. Most simply looked thoughtful. Rebecca was not presenting a complicated solution. She was exposing a connection that had been hiding in plain sight. Mark Sullivan stood and moved closer to the display. You are saying we have been measuring the wrong variables. Rebecca nodded. Not wrong. Incomplete. The distinction mattered. She never framed the situation as a failure. She framed it as an opportunity to see more clearly. That approach changed the reaction instantly. Nobody became defensive. Instead, they became engaged. New data appeared on the screens. Reports were cross-referenced. Environmental information that had previously been treated as background material suddenly moved to the center of the discussion. Within minutes, patterns began emerging. Ethan watched analysts compare information from multiple sources. The same people who had spent hours trapped inside one perspective were now seeing connections they had missed before. One young specialist looked up from his computer and shook his head in disbelief. It was there the entire time. Rebecca smiled faintly. Most important things are. The retired advisor sitting in the corner laughed softly. That sounds familiar. Several older officers smiled. Ethan noticed again that they seemed far less surprised than everyone else. It reinforced a growing suspicion that Rebecca's reputation extended much farther than her modest demeanor suggested. As the room continued working through her framework, confidence gradually replaced uncertainty. Not blind confidence. Informed confidence. Every new piece of information seemed to support her assessment. Every question led to greater clarity. Eventually, one analyst projected a revised model onto the main screen. The room fell silent once more. This silence felt different from the one that had followed Ethan's question earlier that day. That silence had been filled with frustration. This one was filled with understanding. Ethan stared at the display for several seconds before looking back at Rebecca. You saw this after only 20 minutes. Rebecca considered the question. No, Ethan frowned slightly. Rebecca's smile widened just enough to reveal a hint of humor. I noticed something after 20 minutes. Understanding it took much longer. A few people laughed quietly. The tension that had dominated the entire day finally began to disappear. Ethan looked around the room and realized something important. Rebecca had never claimed to be the smartest person there. She had never tried to impress anyone. She simply paid attention when others became distracted by assumptions. And as the revised plan continued taking shape across the screens, Ethan understood why the most experienced people in the room had recognized her name long before everyone else did. They were not reacting to a title. They were reacting to a pattern. They had seen this happen before. The quietest person in the room had once again become the clearest voice. The revised plan continued taking shape long after most people expected the meeting to end. Outside, darkness had settled across the airfield. Runway lights glowed in the distance like quiet stars scattered across the ground. Inside the conference room, nobody seemed interested in leaving. Commander Ethan Brooks stood beside the main display, reviewing the final recommendations generated from Rebecca Hayes's framework. For the first time all day, the information felt coherent. The separate pieces no longer competed with one another. They connected. Analysts moved confidently between stations. Specialists compared updated projections. Conversations that had once been filled with uncertainty now focused on execution. Yet Ethan understood something important. The plan itself was not the most significant development. Trust was. Hours earlier, the room had struggled to agree on anything. Now dozens of experienced professionals were aligning behind a direction that originated from the quietest person among them. Ethan glanced toward Rebecca. She remained seated near the end of the table, reviewing notes with the same calm concentration she had displayed since arriving. Nothing about her behavior suggested she viewed the evening as a personal victory. If anything, she seemed less interested in recognition than everyone else. Mark Sullivan eventually walked over and placed a fresh report beside her notebook. The numbers support your assessment, he said. Rebecca looked through the pages carefully. Good. Mark smiled. That is all you have to say? She returned the report. The data is what matters. Mark laughed softly and shook his head. Nearby, several younger personnel observed the exchange. Ethan noticed the expressions on their faces. Earlier, they had viewed Rebecca as a mystery. Now they viewed her as a reference point. It was a subtle but meaningful change. Respect had replaced curiosity. As the evening progressed, Ethan gathered key personnel for a final review. Every major element of the revised approach was examined again. Questions were asked. Assumptions were challenged. Potential weaknesses were discussed openly. Rebecca encouraged every challenge. She never defended an idea simply because it was hers. When someone raised a valid concern, she listened carefully. When an adjustment improved the plan, she accepted it immediately. The room noticed that too. Confidence built steadily because nobody felt pressured to agree. They were being invited to think. Eventually, the final review concluded. A quiet stillness settled over the room. Ethan looked around the table. Hours of uncertainty had led to this moment. Not certainty. Something better. Clarity. He turned toward Rebecca. Do you trust this? The question carried more weight than anyone realized. Rebecca considered the display, the reports, and the people surrounding her. Then she nodded once. I trust the process that brought us here. Ethan smiled. It was not the answer he expected, but somehow it felt more reassuring than a simple yes. Around the room, people began gathering notebooks and closing laptops. Yet nobody rushed for the door. Many remained seated, studying the final display as though trying to understand how the day had changed so dramatically. Ethan knew the answer. The breakthrough had not arrived because someone possessed secret knowledge. It arrived because one person was willing to question what everyone else accepted. As the lights reflected across the conference table and the airfield remained quiet beyond the windows, Ethan made a decision. The next phase would move forward using Rebecca's approach. It was a choice based on evidence, logic, and trust. More importantly, it was a choice that acknowledged a simple truth. Sometimes the strongest voice is not the loudest one. Sometimes it is the voice that speaks only after listening to everyone else first. The next morning arrived with an unusual sense of calm. For the first time since the challenge began, the atmosphere across the base felt different. Not relaxed, focused. The uncertainty that had followed everyone through the previous day had been replaced by direction. Commander Ethan Brooks noticed it immediately. People moved with purpose. Briefings were shorter. Discussions were clearer. Nobody was wasting energy defending competing theories anymore. They were working from a shared understanding. As sunlight spread across the airfield, teams reviewed the final framework developed the night before. Analysts confirmed updated projections. Specialists compared fresh information against Rebecca Hayes' assessment. Every review seemed to lead to the same conclusion. The pattern held. The logic remained solid. By mid-morning, confidence had quietly replaced doubt. Ethan spent much of the day moving between work areas, speaking with personnel, and reviewing progress. Everywhere he went, he noticed the same thing. People were no longer talking about the problem. They were talking about what they had learned from it. One analyst admitted he had spent hours searching for evidence that supported his original assumption. Another specialist confessed he had ignored information that did not fit the model he preferred. Nobody sounded embarrassed. If anything, they sounded grateful. Rebecca had not exposed a weakness in their abilities. She had exposed a weakness in their thinking. That lesson was proving far more valuable. Shortly after noon, updated reports began arriving from multiple departments. Ethan reviewed them carefully. Each one reinforced the same conclusion. The revised approach was working exactly as intended. No dramatic announcement followed. No celebration erupted across the base. Success arrived quietly. It appeared in accurate projections, in consistent results, in problems that no longer seemed impossible. Ethan stood near the conference room window and watched activity unfold outside. Aircraft moved across the runway. Ground crews completed routine tasks. The world looked exactly as it had the day before. Yet he knew something important had changed. Behind him, several analysts gathered around a display screen reviewing the latest data. Their conversation gradually slowed. One by one, they stopped talking altogether. Ethan turned toward them. Nobody appeared confused. Nobody appeared concerned. They simply stared at the screen. The numbers were clear. The outcome was clear. The conclusion was clear. A young specialist finally broke the silence. She was right. Nobody responded because there was nothing left to add. Across the room, Mark Sullivan leaned back in his chair and smiled. The retired advisor removed his glasses and shook his head in quiet amusement. Ethan looked toward Rebecca. She sat at the same table where she had spent much of the previous day. Her notebook remained open. Her expression remained calm. There was no sign of satisfaction, no sign of triumph. She reviewed a report, made a small correction, and turned the page. It was as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan walked over and placed the final summary on the table beside her. The results are confirmed. Rebecca looked up. Good. Ethan laughed softly. You really do not enjoy making a big deal out of things, do you? Rebecca closed her notebook. The goal was never to be right. Ethan waited. Then what was the goal? She glanced around the room. People were learning, listening, rethinking assumptions. To understand the problem. Ethan followed her gaze. The room that had once been divided by frustration now shared something much stronger. Respect. Not just for Rebecca. For the process she represented. As afternoon sunlight filled the conference room, nobody seemed eager to leave. They were witnessing something rare. Not a perfect solution. A better way of thinking. And in the silence that followed, Ethan realized the most important outcome had never been the challenge itself. It was the reminder that wisdom often enters a room unnoticed, speaks softly, and changes everything before anyone fully understands what happened. Years later, Commander Ethan Brooks would discover that people rarely remembered technical details the way they remembered moments. Reports disappeared into archives. Briefings were replaced by new briefings. Data was eventually updated, revised, and forgotten. Yet certain memories refused to fade. Whenever young officers asked Ethan about the most valuable lesson he learned during his career, he always found himself returning to the same evening. Not because of the challenge itself, not because of the solution, and not because of the outcome. He remembered it because of what happened to the people in the room. On a quiet autumn afternoon many years later, Ethan stood before a classroom filled with future leaders. Some were taking notes. Others listened with folded arms and focused expressions. They expected a story about strategy, planning, or decision-making. Instead, Ethan began with a simple question. Have you ever noticed how often the loudest opinion becomes the most popular one? A few students nodded. Ethan smiled faintly. I used to think confidence and certainty were the same thing. He paused and looked across the room. Then I met someone who taught me otherwise. He told them about a long day inside a conference room. About talented people working hard to solve a difficult problem. About assumptions that seemed obvious until someone challenged them. Most importantly, he told them about a woman named Rebecca Hayes. As he spoke, the classroom became quieter. The students expected a story about expertise. Instead, they heard a story about listening. They expected a story about authority. Instead, they heard a story about humility. They expected a story about someone proving she was the smartest person in the room. Instead, they heard a story about someone helping the room think more clearly. When Ethan finished, one student raised a hand. What happened to her afterward? The question always appeared. Every single time. Ethan smiled. She went back to work. Several students looked surprised. That is it. One asked. Ethan nodded. That is exactly it. Rebecca never tried to build a reputation around that day. She never told the story. She never used it to gain influence or attention. She returned to her normal responsibilities and continued living the same way she always had. Quietly, consistently, thoughtfully. In many ways, that was the most remarkable part. The people who seek recognition often chase it. Rebecca never did. Yet years later, people still remembered her. Ethan occasionally heard updates through mutual contacts. Rebecca continued helping teams solve difficult problems. She continued asking better questions than everyone else. She continued paying attention to details others overlooked. Nothing about her life suggested someone interested in becoming a legend. Yet stories about her continued spreading anyway. Not because she wanted them to. Because they carried lessons worth repeating. The class remained silent as Ethan walked toward the window overlooking the training grounds outside. The afternoon sun stretched across the landscape much like it had on that evening years earlier. One student finally asked the question Ethan had been waiting for. So what was the lesson? Ethan looked back toward the room. The answer arrived immediately. It always did. Most people enter a room trying to prove they have the answer. He paused. Rebecca entered the room trying to understand the question. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The lesson was simple enough to remember and powerful enough to last. Ethan smiled and gathered his notes. The session was ending, but the story was not. Stories like that never really end. They continue every time someone chooses curiosity over certainty. Every time someone listens before speaking. Every time a quiet voice changes the direction of an entire room. And as the students slowly rose from their seats, Ethan found himself remembering Rebecca one final time. She never demanded attention. She never raised her voice. She simply raised the standard. And that was why nobody ever forgot her.